The dust was a living thing. It coated Caleb's tongue with the taste of grit and regret, a fine red powder that settled in the lines around his eyes and clung to the sweat on his neck. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of the town of Redemption, a place named for a sentiment it had long since forgotten. Heat shimmered in waves from the plankboard storefronts, making the world swim and distort, a landscape of broken promises under a bruised purple sky. Silence was the valley's true sovereign, a heavy blanket broken only by the buzz of a persistent fly and the distant, mournful whistle of the train that would eventually arrive. It was a sound that heralded change, and Caleb hated change. He stood beside his wagon, a monument of stoicism carved from the same unforgiven landscape he worked. His shoulders were broad, strained against the worn fabric of his shirt, and his hands, resting on the wagon's sideboard, were maps of hardship. Calluses thick as leather covered his palms, and a latticework of old scars crisscrossed his knuckles, souvenirs of stubborn rock, tangled wire, and the occasional disagreement that could only be settled with fists. He was a man rooted to his solitude, to the sprawling, lonely ranch nestled in the high plains, a place that had taken everything from him and, in return, had given him nothing but space and silence. It was a bargain he had accepted. Now he was about to violate its terms. The mail-order bride advertisement had been a concession to brutal practicality, not a surrender to loneliness. The letters, penned in a neat, flowing hand by a broker in a city far to the east, had described a woman named May. She was, according to the broker, the stout daughter of a farmer, familiar with hardship, strong of back and spirit, seeking a life where her labor would build something that lasted. She was everything he needed. A partner in work, another pair of hands to fight back the relentless decay of his homestead. He expected a woman with shoulders as broad as his own, with hands that mirrored the rugged geography of his. He did not expect romance. He expected resilience. He did not expect companionship. He expected competence. The stagecoach, a lumbering beast of wood and leather, finally groaned into view, kicking up a plume of that omnipresent red dust. It shuddered to a halt in front of the town's only hotel, the horses steaming and blowing, their sides heaving. The door swung open, and a woman descended. The town, what little of it was awake in the oppressive afternoon heat, seemed to hold its breath. Caleb's jaw tightened. This was not May. This could not be May. The woman who stood on the parched ground was a porcelain doll set down in a blacksmith's forge. She was slight of build, her frame looking as if a strong gust of wind might carry her off toward the distant, jagged mountains. Her dress was dark silk, finely made but now dulled with the grime of a long journey, its elegant cut a stark declaration of her foreignness. Her face was a perfect oval, her skin smooth and pale, her dark eyes holding a stillness that was impossible to read. They swept over the desolate street, the leering sun, the hard-faced men who had paused to stare and betrayed nothing. She held a small, sturdy-looking valise in one hand. Her hands. They were what held Caleb's gaze, what turned the tight knot of apprehension in his stomach to cold, hard certainty. They were delicate, slender-fingered, the hands of a lady who had never known a day of real labor in her life. He strode forward, his boots sounding like hammer falls on the wooden boardwalk. He stopped a few feet from her, the sheer size of him casting her in shadow. The scent of sagebrush and sweat clung to him, a stark contrast to the faint, almost unidentifiable scent of crushed flowers that seemed to follow her. "You the one for Caleb Thorne?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, rough as unplaned wood. She met his gaze directly, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. There was no fear in her eyes, only that unnerving calm. "I am the woman who answered the correspondence," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried each word precise and clear, with an accent that was lilting and foreign. The letter said May. He stated the words an accusation, a misrepresentation. "For ease of transaction," she replied, her expression unchanging. "My name is Mei Ling." Caleb's frustration curdled into a quiet, simmering anger. It was a disaster, a complete and utter disaster. He had paid good money, money he had bled for a partner. He had received a fragile piece of art, something that would shatter in the first hard wind. He looked again at her hands, the smooth, unblemished skin. Useless. They were utterly, tragically useless. He could see the whispers starting among the onlookers, the smirks and nudges. The town of Redemption had found its new favorite joke, the solitary rancher and his doll-like Chinese bride. "There's been a mistake," he said, his voice flat and final. "The stage leaves in the morning. You'll be on it." He turned his back on her, intending to walk away, to leave her there for the hotel keeper to deal with. But her quiet voice stopped him. "The agent who arranged my passage took the remainder of my funds," she said, still with that infuriating calm. "The ticket was one way. There is no return journey for me." Caleb stopped, his back still to her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the afternoon heat. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, judging. He had made a bargain, however flawed. His personal code, a rigid and unforgiven thing forged in isolation, demanded he see it through, at least for now. He turned slowly, his face a mask of stone. The sky to the west was darkening, the bruised purple deepening to a malevolent slate gray. A storm was coming, a big one. "Fine," he bit out, the word tasting like ash. "You can stay at the ranch until the next stage, 1 month." He gestured curtly toward his wagon. "Get in." The journey to the ranch was a study in grim silence. The wagon wheels groaned over the rutted track, and the world dissolved into a monotonous landscape of rock and sagebrush. Mei Ling sat ramrod straight on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She did not flinch at the jarring bumps or complain about the dust. She simply endured, a silent, unreadable presence beside him. Caleb could feel her there, a disruption in the familiar rhythm of his solitude, and every inch of him bristled with resentment. He had needed a helper. He had gotten a burden. The storm broke just as they reached the small clapboard house that stood defiantly against the vast emptiness of the plains. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, turning the world outside the windows into a gray, roaring blur. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes and clawing at the roof shingles. It was a fitting soundtrack to the tempest in Caleb's mind. They were trapped, stuck together in this small cabin, a man built of anger and silence and a woman who was a living embodiment of his catastrophic miscalculation. The cabin was Spartan, functional, and bore the unmistakable mark of a man living alone. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cot was pushed into a corner, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust that the wind, even now, pushed through the cracks in the walls. Mei Ling took it all in with that same unnerving equanimity, her eyes missing nothing. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the earth smelling of rain and wet sage. The truce of the storm was over. Caleb, determined to prove his point, To show her, and himself, the impossibility of her presence here, devised a test. He led her to the small barn, the air thick with the scent of hay and horse. In the corner was a pile of tangled, broken leather tack, reins, harnesses, and straps, all stiff with neglect and dirt. "This needs mending," he said, gesturing to the heap. "The awl and thread are on the bench. If you're to earn your keep for the month, you'll start here." It was a cruel task, one that required brute strength to punch through the thick leather and a familiarity with the equipment he was certain she did not possess. He expected her to fail, to give up, to finally break down and show some of the fragility he saw in her delicate frame. He left her there and went about his own chores, the righteous anger of his certainty a cold comfort. Hours later, as the sun climbed high, he returned to the barn, ready to find her defeated. He stopped in the doorway, the sight before him confounding his expectations. Mei Ling was not weeping in frustration. She was sitting on a low stool, a piece of harness laid across her lap. She had not tried to force the awl through the dry leather. Instead, she had found his tub of saddle soap and a rag and was patiently, methodically, working the conditioner into the leather, her small hands moving with a fluid, practiced grace. The stiff material was already growing more supple under her touch. She'd found a small sharpening stone and was honing the tip of the awl to a razor's edge. She was not using force, she was using intelligence. She was solving the problem, not fighting it. He stepped closer, and for the first time he truly looked at her hands. He had been so fixated on their size, their apparent delicacy. But now, in the dusty light of the barn, he saw what he had missed. They were not the hands of a pampered lady. Along the edge of her right thumb and forefinger there was a thin, hard line of a callus, pale and smooth. Another, smaller one was nestled in her palm, just below her ring finger. These were not the broad, rough calluses of a farmhand. They were fine, precise, the marks of repeated, specific pressure on something small and hard. He had seen calluses like that once before, on the hands of a traveling watchmaker who had passed through redemption years ago, a man who worked with tiny gears and delicate springs. But these felt different. They spoke of control, of discipline, of something that required both immense patience and the capacity for sudden, decisive action. She looked up, sensing his presence, her hands stilled on the leather. The leather was too dry, she said simply, as if explaining the obvious to a child. It would split if forced. It must be softened first. Caleb said nothing. He watched as she picked up the newly sharpened awl. She did not try to jam it through. She placed the point, found the old stitch hole, and with a slight, twisting motion that used the leverage of her entire body, she pushed it through cleanly. It was an act of precision, not power. His entire perception of her tilted, like a landscape shifting after an earthquake. He had seen weakness. He had been wrong. A fragile truce settled over the ranch in the days that followed. It was a peace built not on words, for they spoke little, but on a foundation of quiet observation. Caleb watched her. He watched as she moved through his chaotic cabin with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. Within a week, the perpetual dust was gone. His meager supplies were organized, and his solitary meals were replaced by simple, nourishing dishes she conjured from his limited larder. She never complained about the work, the isolation, or his sullen silence. Her own silence was not a void. It was a presence. It was watchful, patient, and, he was beginning to realize, deeply intelligent. He found himself noticing small things. The way she mended a tear in his shirt with stitches so small and perfect they were nearly invisible. the way she could calm his temperamental mare with a soft word and a steady hand, the way she would stand on the porch at dusk, looking out at the vast, empty horizon, her expression unreadable, but her posture radiating a profound and unyielding resilience. The respect that had been grudgingly born in the barn began to grow, an unfamiliar seedling in the barren soil of his heart. He had brought her here to be a pair of hands, and he was discovering that her hands, in their own way, were more capable than he could ever have imagined. But he was also discovering the woman they belonged to, and that was a far more unsettling proposition. The disruption to their quiet routine arrived on a blistering afternoon, in the form of a rider and a plume of dust that signaled unwelcome company. Caleb recognized the expensive horse and the arrogant posture of its rider long before they reached the cabin. Silas Thorne. Thorne was a man who consumed land the way a locust swarm consumed a field, a blight on the valley who believed that everything and everyone had a price. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, controlled the county's only reliable water source, and ruled with a combination of hoarded wealth and hired menace. For years, he had been trying to swallow Caleb's small homestead, the final piece needed to consolidate his empire. Thorne swung down from his horse, his polished boots sinking into the dust Caleb lived with every day. He was flanked by two men whose faces were hard and empty, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. Thorne's gaze swept over the tidy yard, the mended fence line, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He preferred his victims to be in a state of visible decay. "Thorne," Caleb said, his voice flat. He moved to stand on the porch, positioning himself between the visitors and the cabin door. "Caleb," Thorne replied, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes spreading across his face. "Still trying to scratch a living out of this God-forsaken rock pile, I see. I've come to repeat my generous offer." "It wasn't generous the first time," Caleb said, "and the answer is still no." It was then that the cabin door opened and Mei Ling stepped out, carrying a small basket of herbs she had been gathering by the creek. She paused when she saw the men, her expression calm, but her body instantly still, watchful. Thorne's eyes landed on her, and his predatory smile widened. He looked her up and down with an insulting slowness, taking in her slight frame and her foreign features. "Well, well," Thorne sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "What's this? Did you finally get so lonely you ordered yourself some imported decoration? Does she even speak the language, or does she just nod and bow?" Caleb's hands curled into fists at his sides. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "That's enough, Thorne." Thorne ignored him, his focus entirely on Mei Ling. He saw exactly what Caleb had first seen: a fragile, helpless woman, an object to be mocked. "Careful you don't break her, Caleb. She looks like she'd snap in a strong wind." The insult was a physical thing, hanging in the hot, still air. But it was not just an insult to her. It was a dismissal of Caleb, a mockery of his judgment, his life, his home. Thorne turned his attention back to Caleb, his voice hardening, the false affability gone. "This is my final offer. I want this land. I want the water rights that come with it. You have until the end of the month to sign the deed. If you don't, I will build a dam on my property upstream. I will turn your precious creek into a dry bed of cracked mud. This ranch will wither and die, and you along with it, and there's not a thing you or your little China doll can do about it." He spat on the ground near Caleb's feet, a final gesture of contempt. Then he and his men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the suffocating weight of their threat behind. Caleb stood frozen on the porch, the rage inside him a white-hot fire. He had faced threats before, but this was different. Thorne had made it personal. He had crossed a line, dragging Mei Ling into the bitter feud. Caleb looked over at her. She hadn't moved. Her face was pale, but her eyes, fixed on the retreating riders, were like chips of obsidian, hard and glinting with an emotion he could not name. The fragile truce had just been shattered by a declaration of war. Thorne was not a man of patience. His threats were not idle promises for a distant future. They were announcements of immediate intent. The attack came 3 nights later. The moon was a sliver in a star-choked sky, and the silence of the high plains was absolute. It was a silence that Caleb knew intimately, and the faintest sound of a dislodged stone from the direction of the barn was enough to bring him wide awake. He was out of his cot in an instant, grabbing the rifle he kept propped by the door. He moved with a hunter's stealth, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the cabin. He saw them then, 3 figures moving low and fast toward the barn, one of them carrying a torch that cast dancing, malevolent shadows. Fire. They were going to burn him out, destroy the one thing that gave his life structure and meaning. A cold, lethal rage settled over him. The first shot from his rifle sent a splinter of wood flying from the barn door, just inches from one man's head. It was a warning. They answered with a volley of pistol fire that chewed at the log walls of the cabin. Caleb dropped to one knee, using the corner of the porch for cover, and fired again, this time aiming for a leg. A man cried out and went down. 2 left. They were professionals, or close enough. They spread out, using the darkness and the scant cover of the landscape to their advantage, trying to flank him. Caleb was a good shot, a capable fighter, but he was pinned down. One man was keeping him occupied with steady fire, while the other circled around the far side of the house. He heard the crunch of boots on the dry ground, getting closer, coming up on his blind side. He was trapped. He braced himself, knowing he could take one, but the other would get him. Suddenly, a single sharp report cracked through the night, distinct from the deeper boom of his rifle. It came from the cabin porch, from the darkness behind him. The man who had been circling around him let out a choked cry, and his pistol clattered to the ground. He stood there for a moment, clutching his hand, a look of pure shock on his face, before turning and scrambling away into the darkness. Caleb risked a glance over his shoulder. In the faint moonlight, he saw her. Mei Ling stood in the open doorway, his spare revolver held steady in a 2-handed grip. Her stance was not that of a frightened woman firing in panic. It was balanced, solid, practiced. Her arms were extended, her focus absolute. The remaining man, seeing his partner flee, fired one last wild shot in her direction before melting back into the night, dragging his wounded companion with him. Silence descended once more, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the ringing in Caleb's ears. He slowly stood up, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He walked over to the porch, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The useless woman, the fragile doll. She had just saved his life. Mei Ling lowered the revolver, her hands steady, her breathing even. She ejected the spent casing with a flick of her wrist, the small brass cylinder glinting as it fell to the porch floor. The action was so smooth, so economical, it was clear it was born of 1,000 repetitions. She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face in the gloom. All his carefully constructed assumptions about her crumbled into dust. The calluses on her hands suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. They were not from a watchmaker's tools. They were from the checkered grip of a pistol, the sharp edge of a trigger, the unforgiving metal of a hammer. He had seen a liability, and all this time he had been living with a weapon. He reached her side, his gaze dropping from her face to the revolver in her hand, then back again. Questions swirled in his mind, 100 of them, but none of them seemed to matter as much as the simple, undeniable fact of what she had done. The transactional arrangement, the 1-month truce, all of it felt like a lifetime ago. They were no longer a rancher and his mistaken mail-order bride. They were partners in a war they had not chosen but now had to win. Without a word, he took the revolver from her, reloaded the empty chamber, and handed it back. Her fingers closed around the grip, a silent acceptance of the trust and the danger that now bound them together. The days that followed the aborted attack were thick with a new kind of tension. It was not the friction of two strangers forced together, but the taut, humming wire of two soldiers waiting for the next battle. They worked in a synchronized, unspoken rhythm. Caleb reinforced the doors and windows, scouted the perimeter of his land, and cleaned his weapons until they gleamed. Mei Ling, meanwhile, revealed a mind that was as sharp and deadly as her aim. She walked the property with him, her eyes missing nothing. She pointed out natural choke points, fields of fire and weaknesses in his defenses he had never considered. She spoke of tactics, of enfilades and feints, and the strategic importance of high ground, with a dispassionate expertise that was both chilling and awe-inspiring. He learned to listen to her quiet voice, to trust the keen intellect behind her calm gaze. The ranch, once just his solitary fortress, began to transform under their combined efforts into a truly defensible position. He would move a pile of rocks, and she would explain how it could provide better cover. He would clear a patch of brush, and she would show him how it opened up a new line of sight. They were a unit, their disparate skills meshing with a startling efficiency. His strength and knowledge of the land were magnified by her tactical brilliance. The final confrontation came not with the subtlety of a nighttime raid, but with the arrogant brutality of a full frontal assault. Thorne, his ego wounded and his authority challenged, was done with subtlety. He rode down on the ranch at midday, the sun at his back, with a half-dozen men fanned out behind him. It was not an attack, it was an execution. They took cover as the first wave of bullets ripped through the air, splintering the porch railing and punching holes in the cabin walls. Caleb, positioned at a front window, and Mei Ling, at a smaller one on the side that covered the flank, returned fire with disciplined precision. Every shot was aimed. Every bullet had a purpose. There was no panic, only a cold, shared focus. During a brief lull in the fighting, as Thorne's men regrouped behind a rocky outcrop, Caleb looked over at her. Her face was smudged with dust and gunpowder, but her eyes were clear and bright. The time for questions he had never asked was now. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. She reloaded the revolver with swift, practiced movements, never taking her eyes off the terrain outside. "My name is not Mei Ling," she began, her voice even and precise, cutting through the tension like a knife. "It is Leon. My father was a diplomat in a city to the east, a very powerful man with very powerful enemies. He did not believe in raising a daughter for marriage. He believed in raising a daughter to survive." She paused, slotting the final cartridge into the cylinder and snapping it shut. "He hired tutors who taught me history and mathematics, and he hired another who taught me strategy, tactics, and the art of the firearm. When my father was assassinated, his enemies came for me. The mail-order bride service, the name Mei Ling, it was a disguise. a way to disappear into a place so remote, so far from their world, that they would never think to look. Her gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in their depths. "I did not come here seeking a husband. I came here seeking a place to be invisible." The revelation settled over him, explaining everything and changing everything. She was not a victim. She was a survivor, a warrior who had traded one battlefield for another. Before he could respond, another volley of shots rained down on the cabin. Thorn was getting impatient. "They're trying to pin us, draw our fire to the front while two men circle to the back," Leon said, her voice dropping into a purely tactical register. "The woodpile. It's their only cover on that side." Caleb nodded, understanding immediately. They had a plan, one they had devised days earlier for this very contingency. It was a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. He laid down a steady, covering fire toward the rocks at the front, forcing Thorn's men to keep their heads down. Under the cover of the noise, Leanne slipped out the back door, a ghost in the harsh daylight. Caleb counted the seconds, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He heard a shout from the back of the house, followed by 2 quick pistol shots. Then, silence. A terrible, agonizing silence. He forced himself to remain steady, to keep firing, to trust the plan, to trust her. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from a new position, from the small cluster of boulders on the far side of the yard, a position that flanked Thorn and his men. Leon had made it. She had circled around their flankers and taken them out, and now she had Thorn's main force caught in a deadly crossfire. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. Thorn's men, caught between 2 points of attack, panicked. One went down, then another. The rest broke and fled, their loyalty not extending to dying for Thorn's greed. In the end, it was just Silas Thorn, alone, crouched behind the rocks, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He rose, firing wildly at the cabin, a desperate, final act of defiance. Caleb drew a bead with his rifle. At the same moment, Thorn turned, spotting Leon by the boulders. He swung his pistol toward her. 2 shots rang out, so close together they sounded almost as one. Caleb's rifle bucked against his shoulder. Thorn staggered, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He stood there for a long moment, a look of surprise on his face, before collapsing into the red dust, his reign of terror over. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than any silence the valley had ever known. It was the silence of survival. Caleb rushed outside, his eyes scanning for Leon. He saw her walking toward him from the boulders, her revolver hanging loosely at her side. It was only when she got closer that he saw the dark crimson seeping through the sleeve of her dress, a deep gash along her forearm where a stray bullet had grazed her. Inside the cabin, the air was still thick with the smell of gunpowder. He gently pushed up her sleeve. The wound was ugly but clean. As he fetched water and clean linen, she sat at the table, her composure finally beginning to fray, a slight tremor running through her hands. He knelt before her and began to clean the wound, his rough, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. The quiet stretched between them, no longer a space of awkwardness or tension, but of shared understanding. He finished bandaging her arm, his touch lingering for a moment on her skin. He looked up at her and truly saw the woman named Leon, the diplomat's daughter, the survivor, the warrior who had stood with him and saved everything he had. He looked down at her hands, the one he held now resting in his own. He saw the fine, hard calluses, the slender fingers, and he no longer saw weakness or strangeness. He saw strength. He saw resilience. He saw the hands that had saved his life, his home, and his future. He gently raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture of reverence that was more eloquent than any words he possessed. Weeks bled into months. The harshness of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The valley healed. With Thorn gone, his empire dismantled by distant legal entities, a fragile peace settled over the land. The creek, which Thorn had briefly dammed in a final act of spite, was flowing freely again, a ribbon of life-giving water through Caleb's property. The town of redemption, once a source of gossip and scorn, now regarded the ranch on the high plains with a kind of superstitious awe. The whispers about the useless Chinese bride had died, replaced by hushed, embellished tales of the quiet woman who fought like a demon. Sheriff Brody had come and gone, taking statements and carting away bodies, his questions few and his gratitude immense. The law, for once, had aligned with justice. The ranch itself seemed to breathe easier. The bullet holes in the cabin walls were patched, the splintered porch rail replaced. A small garden, which Leon had insisted on planting, now flourished with stubborn greens and herbs, a splash of vibrant life against the muted tones of the landscape. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, filled with the quiet hum of two people building a life together, one day at a time. The silence between them had transformed completely. It was now a comfortable blanket, a shared space where words were often unnecessary. One evening, they sat on the newly repaired porch, a rare stillness between their chores. The sun had set, leaving the sky painted in deep indigos and soft violets. A chill was in the air, a promise of the coming winter. Caleb had been showing her the constellations, his rough finger tracing the shapes in the sky, the hunter, the bear, the great river of stars that flowed across the heavens. It was a knowledge passed down from his father, one of the few gentle things the man had ever given him. Leon, in turn, leaned forward and, with her finger, drew a complex character in the thin layer of dust that had settled on the porch rail. It was a beautiful, intricate symbol of lines and curves. "What does it mean?" Caleb asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "Gia," she said softly. She traced it again. "It means home, but it also means family. In my language, the two are often the same word, a roof over your head and the people who make it worth having." He looked from the symbol to her face, illuminated in the soft starlight. He saw not the stranger who had stepped off the stagecoach, nor the deadly warrior who had fought by his side, but the woman who had brought order to his chaos, peace to his troubled heart, and life to his desolate land. The contract, the lie, the entire premise of their meeting had been burned away in the fire of shared crisis, leaving only the truth of what they had become to each other. He cleared his throat, the words feeling clumsy and heavy in his mouth. "The contract I signed," he began, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "It was for a wife, for a woman named May. That paper's long gone. The arrangement, as it was, it's over." He paused, and the silence felt vast as the sky above them. He finally turned to look at her, to meet her steady, knowing gaze. "But the one we have now," he continued, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name, "the one we made right here. It stands. If you'll have it. If you'll stay." It was not a declaration of love, not in the way the poets wrote about it. It was something more solid, more real. It was a statement of fact, an offer of permanence, a commitment forged not of promises but of shared survival. It was everything he was, laid bare. Leon did not offer a grand reply. She simply reached out and placed her hand over his on the porch railing. Her hand, with its fine, hard calluses and its surprising strength, fit perfectly against his. She gave a single, slow nod, her eyes never leaving his. In that simple gesture, a new contract was signed, one written not in ink, but in shared glances, quiet labor, and the silent, unshakable knowledge that they had both, against all odds, finally found their way home.